everyone, I'm Matt, and welcome to the Good Trouble Show. American democracy is under siege, and it's not where you would expect. The Pentagon and the intelligence community, particularly the CIA, have continued to obfuscate and lie to our members of Congress. Today we have a guest that will discuss the legal implications of UAP and really kind of what's happening in Congress and what we can hope for. But first, please hit the subscribe and thumbs up buttons on YouTube. You can let us know what you think about this episode in the comments. We always love that. You can also find us on Twitter at Good Trouble Show and all other social media platforms at The Good Trouble Show. And of course, we're on all the podcasting platforms. Just search for The Good Trouble Show with Matt Ford. We also need your help keeping the lights on. You can become a supporter of The Good Trouble Show by going to let's see here, www.patreon.com/The Good Trouble Show. And for the price of a coffee, you can support our work. Finally, on YouTube, Super Chats are open and are a great way for you to show your financial support for this show. I want to thank our Patreon and YouTube supporters. Today we do not have a chat with Cinco de Mayo. Everyone had plans today, so we will not be taking any audience questions. So next time we will. And actually, speaking of next time, this coming Sunday, we have Dr. Avi Loeb, who will be joining us. We're going to hopefully dedicate probably about half of our show to audience questions. So please make sure that you come with some questions in hand. Of course, we always give priority question-wise to our Patreon supporters and people that do super chats. But it's always it'll be a first for me having him on the show. This guy's really been an icon, and everyone I think is always interested to hear what Dr. Loeb is up to. So we've got that coming up again this coming Sunday. Same bat time, same bat channel, 12 noon Pacific. Okay, here we go. So our next guest is a former city attorney and special counsel advising local governments on everything from environmental law to election issues. And as an author, he has been published in multiple legal publications. And since his retirement, he has written these two books here. Oh, wrong button. There we go. I'll turn that off. Okay, yeah, so he's got two books under his belt. UFO Briefing Book, a Congressional Guide to Oversight of the UAP Phenomenon, and his earlier book, A Threat to the Body Politic. Actually, no, I think that is the most recent one. Foo Fighters to UAP. Please welcome Jim Lough. Jim, how are you, sir?
Good. How about you?
Actually, I'm well, thanks. It's we originally had Beatriz Villarreal scheduled for today, but she came down with a little bug, and Jim was kind enough to join our show at a very short moment's notice. We have been planning to have you on for a bit, and hey, it got moved up, unfortunately, due to Beatriz being under the weather. But I'm super glad you're here. So thank you for coming.
Works for me. Thank you for having me.
Excellent. And we've chatted a bit before, and what I found was interesting. I'm no lawyer, I'm not an attorney, so kind of speaking about the legal implications of UAP is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, especially in terms of what is going on with Congress. And we know, of course, that what Congress is up to with the whole UAP thing is, of course, extraordinarily important. So let's start here. I always am interested in what got people interested, our guests, in this subject, but I understand you are actually an experiencer. Perhaps you would like to share just a little bit about that before we get into your work.
Yes, I fortunately or unfortunately have had many sightings and interactions with non-human intelligence, and it's something, when you work in the public sector, it's something I never talked about till I was retired, and sort of keep it to myself, because when you're representing the mayor in an election case, you don't talk about UFOs. And when the other side doesn't have any arguments, they like to throw mud at the person on the other side. So kept it to myself mostly for my clients.
That I completely understand that. So I'm curious. So post retirement, when you went public with this, some of your former colleagues, did you hear from them and say, "Wow, I never knew about this," or "Hey, I've also had experiences too"?
But most just, oh, how interesting. And then they change the subject and go to something else.
Yeah, it's funny. I found that you either don't believe it entirely, like you're one of the debunkers, professional debunkers, or you believe it, or you think it's real, and then there are people that know it's real because they've experienced it, and then you have people that are quite sure it's real or feel that it's real, but the whole idea of talking about it just makes them completely uncomfortable, and they end up changing the subject. I've got one friend of mine that used to work in air traffic control, and he, while he never experienced anything, he certainly believes it's true, but you can tell that the whole topic is just a little bit unsettling, and yeah, that's understandable, I would say.
I give people space on it, because
Absolutely.
Dr. John Mack talked about many social or physical scientists talked about and social scientists about the ontological shock that you have whenever you've had these experiences, and a little bit of that ontological shock seems to be going through Congress right now,
I
where
would.
they just don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think, and we'll get into this because really kind of what I'd like to start off with is some of the history of this. And in one of your books, you really dug into this quite heavily in terms of the national security state and how that came about and how that really kind of molded the current place we are in politically and legislatively on this whole thing. I mean, it is definitely a sticky wicket, and as I've said before, I do not envy a president or members of Congress that understand that this whole thing is real and that there's a lot of really bad history on the Americans' part that we have to find some constructive way of unwinding ourselves from it. And when I say ourselves, the United States government, without damaging itself, because we certainly know that we have not done some very good things in the management of this particular issue.
Well, when you think about 1947 was sort of the starting point of the modern phenomena, and you have to think about what was going on in 1947. We had won World War II, and we're immediately faced with a rival in the Soviet Union that had nuclear weapons, and so to have all of a sudden flying saucers popping up, it would be surprising if the government didn't keep it secret at that time because of everything that was going on. And the trouble with secrecy is when you end it, you have to explain everything you've done. So it gets, I think of the CIA and the Air Force and several of them as digging a hole, and they've dug so far that it's hard for them to get out and figuring out how to get out.
Yeah. Well, and you think about it too, the fact that this has gone on for so long, that's a lot of dirt digging that has occurred with the CIA and and the Air Force. I can't, they probably dug their way halfway to China by now with all of the lies and the obfuscation. And I think it was my mom that told me this. It's like it's often not the lie that is so bad; it's the cover up and the subsequent lying to hide the original sin. And now we're in a situation where the CIA, who has been the portfolio holder of this thing, and the Air Force, which, as you noted in your book, they've really worked pretty hand in hand, have really backed themselves into a corner that is is obviously looks bad on them, but is also really, quite frankly, is undermining our democracy. And the fact that they continue to lie to Congress and we'll just say try and hold things over certain people in Congress, hold things over their head to encourage them not to keep digging. It's the whole thing is just atrocious. It truly is, and it quite frankly, it makes me very worried for the state of American democracy. But yeah, let's talk about 1947 because the National Security Act of 1947 really set the stage for where we are today. Correct?
That is absolutely correct. And the fact that Roswell, which I don't write about in the book, happened the same month as that took effect, it put things, the public side of it, put things in the hands of people that were still trying to figure out where the bathroom was. I mean, the Department of War was gone. Mm-hmm. There was an Air Force. There was a CIA, all of whom didn't exist before July of 47. And so they're still trying to figure out how to locate in that new Pentagon building they just built. And all of a sudden, a world-shattering revelation occurs. Now, it may have happened before that point, but during that point is when everything pretty much became public. And looking at it today from the side of our elected officials, you've got a very good polling company, YouGov, did a poll in 2022, September. And what they came up with is that roughly 1/3 of the public believes in UFOs, 1/3 of the public does not, and 1/3 of the public doesn't know. And so whatever the government announces, 2/3 are going to say, that's not what I thought.
Right.
And so, it becomes a political problem. And having spent a career working with elected officials, many of whom went on to go to Washington, you start to see sort of the mind of the individual and what their motivations are. They're like regular people, but regular people don't do their job under a microscope. And right. So it makes them a little different in that regard. And so, just think in 2015, 2016, around that time, the naval UAP sightings were boiling over, and Congress and the National Security Committees started looking into it behind the scenes. And with the help of the program that was started in 2007 by Harry Reid, there was a little more background. So it gave someone like Lou Elizondo a chance to bring forward the information that became declassified. And those 3 videos turned it from just a bunch of politicians behind the scenes going, what do we do now? To all of a sudden it was public. And it was like, we have to do something now. And so it's been quite a change in a small period of time.
It very much is. And I want to get to that end of it a little bit later in the program in terms of sort of the current legislative stuff. But what I've always found fascinating is how we got to this point. And as you mentioned, we had the National Security Act of 1947 that really set the stage for where we are today. You had the Cold War heating up, and of course, Roswell, which obviously occurred, and I would imagine that when all of this occurred, and CIA was formed, and the Air Force became the Air Force. They really kind of from the onset, they worked hand in hand, CIA and Air Force, in terms of figuring out what to do with this topic, correct?
That's correct. In 1952, there was a UFO wave, they call them, where lots of sightings. And the last two weekends in July of that year, 52, there were multiple sightings over Washington, D.C., which could not be swept under the rug like Roswell was. And during that time, Harry Truman turned to the CIA and asked the newly formed CIA to look into it. And they immediately partnered. In the end of July was when the sightings really hit their peak. And by the first week in August, the Air Force and the CIA started meeting on a regular basis. And hats off to Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, is that there were a tranche of documents that started coming out about 2001, thanks to the Clinton administration. In 2010, there were a lot more, probably thanks to the Bush administration, W. Bush. And probably 75% of the declassified documents that are in both of my books came from that time period. And wow. And so what you saw looking at those is, it was sort of like sifting through the tea leaves, but you started to see repeated patterns. The worry of the Air Force and the CIA was that, okay, we got through the 52 summer rush. We have to be ready if it happens again in summer of 53. And so eventually they went back and forth. Do we have an academic study? Do we leave it to MIT or Princeton or Caltech? Because if you remember during well, you may not, none of us were alive, but during World War II, most of the scientific research for weapons development and radar and those sort of things were done through academic institutions. And there's good and there's bad with that. And so what happened is, during the time period that the CIA and the Air Force were looking at this, they also had an election, and Dwight D. Eisenhower won. And not only that, but they ended up with a majority Republican Congress. And they got to that point by being tough on the Reds and being against the communist menace. And for a party that was isolationist before World War II, that was a big switch. And in reading these documents, you could see the ties between the way the CIA and the Air Force approached the communist threat, and sort of drawing parallels to the UFO issue, and sort of they came out with, between the time Harry Truman in early August or late July, had them look into it. And by the time about late November, early December of that year, when they knew that there was going to be a massive change in administrations, the first one since 1932, that they'd have to look at it a different way. And so you see in these records, they were very worried, wanted to keep a lid on it. And so needed to develop tools that, using sort of my title, Threat to the Body Politic, is a sort of a shortened version of a quote in the CIA Robertson panel report, which was sort of a compromise between an academic study and just a quick study to identify what UFOs were. That they were able, during that time period, to come up with policies that, in their minds, they were worried that people that had an interest in UFOs were a threat to the body politic, or the collective organs of the body politic. And so they saw American citizens as threats. And so when I've done a lot of reading over the years about the Robertson panel, but most of it relates to how they got it wrong on UFOs and all the things they did about that. But when you really look at what they did, their purpose was to come up with an infrastructure or a way to approach the issue to minimize it completely out of existence if they could.
Now,
And
sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. No, go ahead.
So when the Robertson panel was formed, or well, let me ask, like prior to when the Robertson panel was formed, did the CIA or the Air Force suspect that this could have been Russian, Russian tech or some kind of Russian platform, since obviously the Red Scare was going on and everyone was quite worried about where we were in terms of the Cold War? Or did they know at that point, by the time they put the Robertson panel together, and I want to dig into that here in a second, or did they realize at that point that this was not something prosaic?
They knew at that point, but what they did is they used the communist threat to come up with a solution. The CIA basically spoon fed this to to 5 physicists who all work, despite what the CIA website currently says, they were not 5 non-military scientists. Every single one of them worked on weapons projects before and after World War II, and were very used to keeping secrets. Many of them worked in the Manhattan Project. They know how to keep secrets, and so they knew that they weren't, but by tying it to a worry about a fake invasion, they could tie it to the Red Scare. That interest in UFOs was, in the words of a couple of the reports from the Air Force, were not in the best interests of this country, is the way they put it. And it's some of the UFO people, they said, without evidence, in their notes of the meetings, that some of the people involved with UFOs were basically acting outside of the interests of the country, sort of explaining that we really can't tell if they're communists or not, and so leaving that over the thing. It's interesting. While the Robertson panel was going on, the House on Un-American Activities was in Hollywood doing hearings, and I'll talk a little bit about where the two intersected. Little.
Interesting. Yes, so it was really kind of a pretty interesting time period, obviously during that part, and I understand as well that the former director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, was he after the Robertson panel, or was he before? Because I understand in your book that he played a really big part in kind of setting everything up.
Well, Allen Dulles was originally one of Wild Bill Donovan's World War II spies. He was stationed in Switzerland, and so when the CIA got formed, he was brought in as an assistant director. Truman did not trust him, and there's a lot of good reasons, and we can look back today and see why. But Dulles was, along with his brother, John Foster, who became the Secretary of State, under the Eisenhower administration, became a very formidable duo. And everything they did was sort of wrapped in the war against communism. And so when the Robertson panel was formed, it sort of used that tie to paint UFOs as something not only sort of a fringe subject, but also dangerous to like I say, the body politic, dangerous to the government itself.
And dangerous to the government itself in how Americans would react to it, or what specifically were they afraid of in terms of, the threat to the government?
Well, what the CIA originally said to the Robertson panel was that they were worried about citizens panicking and having a false UFO invasion of fake objects, being a precursor for a Soviet invasion, where they would, at the time, there were no intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so the main threat, nuclear threat, was from slow-moving bombers coming from Russia over Alaska and Canada. And at the time, we did not have a radar picket line over there. And so it was claimed that at least the CIA and Air Force pushed the narrative to the Robertson panel that we have to fix this hole and we've got to stop people from having this morbid interest, and that's a quote right out of the Robertson panel, in UFOs. And so their goal was to do two things. One was to basically explain to the public that there's no such thing as UFOs, that every single one was either the product of a mistaken identity, a hoax, or a delusional mind. And so they wanted to do that. The other portion of the Robertson panel was to try to set up an infrastructure of how they would sort of keep the genie in the bottle. And it was right. I personally don't see it as this massive deep state conspiracy, that a few tweaks in the system and that worked very well. And it started with the panel. They used the panel's report, which was based on cases that were hand-fed to the panel. They did no individual investigations themselves, only took what the CIA and Air Force gave them. And
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
oh yeah. See, as a lawyer, the first thing you look for is evidence.
Sure.
And all of, right now there are probably 5 or 6 different, or quote unquote, originals of the Robertson panel report. However, there can only be one original. There can't be a bunch of different ones. And so the report itself is only like 3 pages long, but there were comments of the panel that were about 30 pages long in one copy, 10 pages in another. And so over the years, they've put out different ones. And so more and more is seeped out. And it sort of gives it shows what a lie the whole process was. It was designed and set up for the result that Dulles wanted. And during 1953 and 54, Allen Dulles not only, took a more aggressive stand than the Truman administration on intelligence, but they took more active measures. So around that time in 1954, the government of Guatemala was changing and becoming more democratic, which was bad for United Fruit Company, United Fruit Company was a client of the Dulles brothers law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And so the CIA went into Guatemala and helped, get rid of the democratic movement in 54. And we still are feeling the effects of that today. At the same time, the Dulles team helped stop the budding of democracy that was just starting in Iran and installed the Shah. And we've been living with that one too. And so these issues aren't just UFO related. It was a pattern in practice. And within the US, there were letter opening operations. There was in 1954, Dulles approved a program called MK Ultra, which had testing drugs, giving, unbeknownst to them, giving volunteers LSD and other, drugs that ended up killing people. And so they used a lot. The UFO thing was just one of the many different operations that Alan Dulles started, and culminating in whenever he was at the end of his tenure with the Bay of Pigs operation. So active measures, make up the history of the Cold War. And a lot of this information has just come out in the last 20 years. And so some of the best books on these issues, I've cited about 5 or 6 books on Dulles brothers in my work. And a lot of this stuff got its start back then. And so it wasn't just putting down the UFO issue. It was also just making sure they could control the American people and rile them up when they wanted them riled up and not. And so you have to remember, back then, it was a time that people respected the government. People took their word as it's almost hilarious reading some of the documents in that time. The Civil Defense Authority from that time had a document in it that said, the only thing they talked about panic. So they never followed the Robertson panel recommendations, even though they met on it. The Civil Defense Authority. The thing that they thought was, the Civil Defense Authority thought was the worry about panic, was that people wouldn't know what was going on and they'd panic, but they should know, and as the reports said, with proper indoctrination, we can make sure that the American people know that people are handling this and they know what they're doing.
They know what they're doing. That's pretty damn funny.
Literally out of the annual report of the Federal Civil Defense Authority, that people know what they're doing or in charge. Well,
wow.
I mean, we had nuclear weapons for what? At that point, that in 1954, we had them for 9 years. And so how could you say we knew what they were doing? We were still learning it. And so that was the period of trust, is just listen to us.
Trust me, bro. That's what Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick does now. He's like, oh, trust me, bro. Congress has been hoodwinked. There's a lot of the trust me, bro vibe going on. And during this time, I mean, really the CIA was completely rogue, right? I mean, you had MK Ultra that you were talking about. I believe, and a lot of this came out, from what I understand, during the church committee, which I think was 1973. But the fact that you had this thing called the National Student Organization, the NSA, different than the NSA today, right, that the CIA was using cutouts to install people into this National Student Organization. Basically, the CIA figured out that the national student organizations, which were these chapters all across the world at university campuses, that a lot of the people that were the leaders of these would end up going on into a career of politics. So the CIA decided, let's see what we can do to influence those guys. And the CIA was using cutout companies to pay them. It was just insane. And then also, of course, what we know about too out of that was that the CIA, I think it was Operation Mockingbird, was paying American journalists to spread American propaganda. And it wasn't just the journalists, it was editors of major newspapers, CBS News. I mean, the CIA was like, they were like, their amplifier was running at level 11 in terms of the corruption and the things that they were doing at the time.
It was really hard to stay to UFOs.
Right.
The church committee report is probably one of the best sources I ever used on this. And what they talk about at times that intelligence agencies went rogue, in a variety of subjects. UFO is just one of them. It was a big one though, because they lose this one, and it's a big, it's a big one to overcome. And so that, to me, back to the analogy of digging the hole, they kept digging deeper and deeper, and probably don't know how far down they are.
Yeah, I imagine pretty far down. I don't know how they're going to dig out of this thing. So going back to the Robertson panel, and as I always say on the show, I'm not a UFO historian. I'm not a ufologist. So my knowledge about this topic is pretty much like a big chunk of Swiss cheese with lots of holes in it. So who was this Dr. Robinson, and who were some of the people that were on this panel? And was Robertson, was he corrupt, or was how was all of that set up in terms of who was on the panel?
The five panelists were all patriots and highly educated, highly competent physicists. And so it was not a group of corrupt people. However, what they did is they had worked through World War II, on secret issues from radar. H.P. Robertson, Harold Percy Robertson was the chair of the committee, and he had worked as a science advisor for the Supreme Allied headquarters in London during World War II. And he was one of the two panelists who were tasked to work on Foo Fighters at the same time. And so he knew about UFOs before he got on the panel. And it was interesting, after he was off the panel, he became the science advisor for the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO in Europe in 1954. It was the same year that there was a UFO wave in Europe. Like 75% of all sightings during that time period were in Europe. And so it's amazing that they sent him there after this started. And so what you have is an individual who helped America get through World War II and wanted to help America get through the Cold War with its nuclear, destruction consequences. And so one of the scientists that worked with him on Foo Fighters, a scientist named Alvarez, was later a Nobel Prize winner in physics. And to show they just did this one little thing and then never came back to it again, most of them. Walt, his Alvarez was a professor at Berkeley. He also, his son was a geologist, and Walter Alvarez, and they were talking one time about his problem that he had in his. He kept finding iridium about 65 million years ago, and talking to his dad over Thanksgiving dinner or something. It was a family event. He talked about why is this covering over everything? And so he said iridium's from meteorites and comets. It's an element in that. And so they both theorized that the dinosaurs died in a mass extinction. And so they're the one that put that theory up. And so that they were accomplished people. Besides, they weren't just hacks for this particular issue. They were chosen because they worked with the military, kept secrets, and were always working in the best interests of the country. And so they thought they were doing the right thing, I think. But what the CIA and the Air Force took with it and ran is another matter.
So what were the conclusions of the panel? And then I want to talk about exactly what the Air Force and the CIA did with those conclusions.
First of all, that there were no such thing as UFOs. That was their main conclusion that everyone talks about. But the rest of it was the worrisome part. Is they said that because of the aura that UFOs have unfortunately acquired, that if it's allowed to continue to reverberate throughout society, that it could be subject to skillful manipulation by the Soviets. And so we needed to figure out how to put UFOs that didn't exist to offensive and defensive weapon situations. The offensive weapon was the CIA talked about, and so did the Robertson panel, developing offensive uses in the Soviet Union using this UFO panic theory. Well, at the time, the Soviet press had no comment on UFOs. We know now from declassified records that came out after the fall of the Soviet Union that they did know, but so it's really hard. Number one, the CIA had no real human assets in Russia at the time. So how are you going to use a subject like UFOs that none of the Russian citizens, except if they'd seen one, knew about? So the offensive weapon part that they talk about in the report, just based on the facts on the ground, there's no way they'd ever do that. But they talked about defensive uses and how they do that. And that was the part that led to the civil liberties violations I've talked about in the book, in that the defensive thing was to prevent the public from ever believing that UFOs, are real, because if they're not real, they can't be a threat through a fake UFO invasion. And how the UFOs are going to be confused for slow-moving, propeller-driven Russian bombers is beyond me. And it was beyond the Federal Civil Defense Authority too, because they thought that the only sneak attack would be from missiles by Russian submarines. And at the time, submarines were not nuclear capable. And so, they manufactured a crisis that didn't exist. And the purpose was to cover up UFO stuff. And and I later go through policies that the Air Force and CIA developed that took little effort but had tremendous effect on people.
So it sounds like the CIA and the Air Force went into like full on debunking mode post the Robertson panel and following the conclusions of it. What were some of the things that were like a clear violation of our civil liberties that the CIA and the Air Force participated in or acted upon following the Robertson panel?
Well, let me start with one that eliminated probably the best UFO study group ever. There was a group in Los Angeles called Civilian Saucer Investigators of Los Angeles, and it was a mom and pop group. But some of those mom and pops were scientists.
And say that again? Sorry, cut out. They were what?
Some of them were scientists.
Oh, okay.
And so the North American aviation in particular was the center of a lot of UFO people with interest in them. They were scientists or engineers. And a lot of them volunteered for this little mom and pop group, and they'd send out newsletters, and they did scientific analysis of UFO reports. In 1953, the biggest selling Life magazine ever had Marilyn Monroe cover. On the upper right-hand corner, which people never look at because they're too busy looking at Marilyn Monroe, there's a reference on the front page on the cover to the case for interplanetary UFOs. And it was an article written in Life magazine and just happened to be on the cover of the most popular edition of all time, thanks to Marilyn Monroe. And it was a story written by Life magazine reporters, but they used scientific analysis from these scientists that were working on defense projects, but in their spare time would volunteer. One of them was a scientist named Dr. Walter Reuther. And Walther, I'm trying to remember, it's not Reuther, it's I can't remember his last name right now.
That's okay.
But he was brought to the U.S. He was Werner von Braun's assistant on the V2 program. And he was brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. And so he got involved with the UFO people doing little, scientific review of UFO sightings. And those sightings form the basis for, there are more than just a person seeing one, as the French scientist said in the 18th century, only peasants see rocks falling from the sky before meteors were invented. So it's always, so here it was always the dumb farmer that would say they saw a UFO. Well, when you have scientists doing a scientific analysis and there's something there that isn't what the government's saying, this group was the first sort of flying saucer club, as they were called back then, that had some background to it and some heft. But I got to do a little timeline now.
Sure, no problem.
The CIA Robertson panel finished on Saturday, January 17th. On Tuesday, January 20th, Dwight Eisenhower was sworn in as president. On January 31st, there was a meeting of the Office of National Estimates. And that was the organization the CIA had that would predict where um, different issues would go and which were threats that we had to worry about and how much. And this was a CIA only group. They brought in a retired ambassador for the meeting on the 31st, and they brought in a retired general, neither of whom had been named, but a gentleman named Dr. Edgar Hoover was present, the only non-CIA person besides the ambassador and the general. And what they did is they got a briefing on the Robertson panel conclusions. That was on January 31st. By March 8th, there was a memo written by a FBI agent that is unnamed. They crossed it out. It was written directly to the Office of Scientific Intelligence of the CIA that was in charge of the UFO issue, with no copies to anyone else. And it was a contact sheet between an FBI agent and this Nazi scientist that came over who was working on UFO stuff. And the memo talked about how he was under enormous pressure to get out of doing UFO stuff. Now, the memo reads like it was a chance occurrence that they met. However, how many FBI, you have to remember, FBI, even back then, was in charge of counterintelligence. And so you couldn't get or keep a classification to work on a defense issue without approval of the FBI. Okay. And so they met with this guy. They told him that he needed to drop this stuff, that others were dropping it. And he immediately left civilian saucer investigators after that. And there was an exodus of other people like him from CSI. And so what happened was they lost all their scientists and engineers that would help them look at what, these sightings were really like, instead of just taking the Air Force's word. And so that was one of the first things that the Robertson panel talked about, is that the civilian saucer investigators, one of the two UFO groups in the country that needed to be watched because of their possible influence on the public. And it says it right in the, they use the term watch.
In the Robertson panel report, they say that.
Yes. In the actual report is just a page, but in the conclusions of the panel attached to it, that's what it said.
Wow.
And so it's right there in black and white. And you've got declassified records, most of which came out from 2010 on. And one that showed J. Edgar Hoover was at that meeting where the first briefing outside of the Robertson panel was given. And within a month, they had the top scientist that was working on UFO issues in the private sector stopped doing it. And so just one chance, if you're a former Nazi scientist who's airdropped into Burbank, California, in a cool job building rockets, and you have an FBI agent telling you, you can't do this anymore. What are you going to do? You're going to go back to Germany and then end up in Russia? I don't think so. You're going to quit. And then when everyone sees at North American, well, he quit. How come? Well, he had a visit from an FBI agent. By early 1954, civilian saucer investigators folded up and gave up.
Wow.
And so they were able to get rid of probably the number one source in the public of neutral information about what's happening with UFOs. And so there were other little methods that they did that I could talk about, but
Please, yeah.
yeah, probably one of the best methods of keeping the public uninformed was the Air Force. The Air Force, they had Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book had a newspaper clipping service. Now, before the internet, how did you know what was being talked about around the country? There's nothing trending,
Right.
when you pick up your newspaper off your porch and pick up the milk bottles and bring them in. The newspaper clipping services were 158 newspapers around the country. This clipping service would get the newspapers from each of these newspapers and then would physically clip the article out and send it to their client. And so all the UFO stories, those top 158 newspapers were sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So what did Wright-Patterson do? Is they would have local Air Force Office of Special Investigations personnel, in Air Force intelligence, they would go out to a person's house that the newspaper had said they'd taken a picture of a UFO. Now think about this. UFOs just fly around, and they're not going to just fly in front of people that are into UFOs. And after World War II, Kodak and Polaroid put out mass production photography. And so people would have home movies, they would take pictures at picnics, things that before that point weren't that common. And so you'd know that some would take a picture of a UFO. You have your camera there for another reason. So the average person that took a picture would say, I wonder what this is. Looks like one of those flying saucers they're talking about. And what would happen is the Air Force AFOSI officer would come and knock on their door. Are you Fred Smith, the guy that took a picture of a UFO flying saucer? Yes. Do you mind if we take it for investigation? Well, of course. I want to ask the government.
Wow.
People never thought of this. Is we all lived in a post Watergate era.
Right.
After the church committee told us about all these terrible things. Well, the time when government had the highest trust levels, and so people would just automatically give it to them. One case was in 1960, and I found that when you want something bad about the Air Force, you look in an FBI file or a CIA file. If you want something bad about the CIA, you look in an Air Force or an FBI file. They always, their censors, declassify things. If it gored someone else's ox, they didn't care, because the FOIA people that are declassifying things, they work for the Air Force and they don't work for the. And so I found this in FBI. I found like maybe 20 documents about this gentleman named Joseph Perry. Joseph Perry owned a pizza parlor in Flint, Michigan. And he loved going outside at night, and he would take pictures with his telescope of celestial objects, mostly the moon. And he took one night, he took 20 pictures of the moon. 18 were underexposed. 2 of them, one was just blank and showed the moon. The other showed a classic flying saucer according to the FBI file, was somewhere between the end of his telescope and the moon that the
Wow.
saucer was.
Okay.
So he started showing him to he didn't know anything about UFOs. And so he started showing him to his customers at the pizza parlor, and they're going, "You've got a flying saucer picture." And his first thought was, "I've got to get this to the authorities."
Of course.
So he
Yeah.
went to the local FBI office in Detroit and said, "Would you please get these pictures to the proper authorities? And I want them back unless you tell me they tell me it's top secret." So he turned over the pictures. There'd been, because of his talking to people at his pizza parlor, the local paper found out about it. And so they interviewed him, and one story came out saying that the FBI was investigating. And so the FBI office in Detroit sent a copy of the article to J. Edgar Hoover. Nobody else, no CCs to their boss or anything else, just straight to J. Edgar Hoover. And he got about 15 different memos from them over a 2-week period, keeping him up to date, nobody else. And so they took his picture. Hoover wrote back saying, "You need to tell them, the newspapers, that we don't investigate UFOs." And so they did that, and they ran another article saying that Selfridge Air Force Base outside of Detroit was where they were going to, where these pictures went. So it once it hit the paper, Joseph Perry had a bunch of UFO types, flying saucer people, show up, including someone from NICAP, which was the biggest organization at the time. And so they told him that, "You're never going to get your pictures back." And he goes, "They promised me." So he got mad,
Uh-huh.
and he wrote a letter to President Eisenhower that he sent on March 9th of 1960. That letter was back on J. Edgar Hoover's desk within 9 days of him putting it in the mailbox, literally. Now, that's pretty quick for back then.
Yeah.
And so the FBI reached out to the Air Force, and they told him, "We never got the pictures." And so you've got this file of like 20 different back and forth between the agent involved in J. Edgar Hoover and nobody else, and the pictures disappeared. And J. Edgar Hoover eventually wrote to Joseph Perry saying, "We turned over our picture to the Air Force, your pictures to the Air Force. I suggest you talk to them about what happened." And he left it at that. And Perry was happy with that answer, but he never got his pictures back. And
Of
I
course.
cite 5 other examples in the book just like that, where Air Force people, or in one case, fake NORAD people showed up and took the pictures. And this happened from 54 to 65 are the examples I use. And so they don't do that now because they don't need to. Because all you have to do is comment that it was photoshopped. And
Right.
everyone will say, "Hey," so they don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. They also have Mick West to help them out. So
Oh yeah.
there is that. So all of these efforts by the Pentagon, the CIA, and then the FBI. I mean, I did not know about the AFOSI folks going around. If these were like Air Force personnel off duty or whatever, I could completely see OSI showing up at their door. But the fact that these guys were going to just average citizens and confiscating this stuff or hoodwinking them into giving
Yes.
them these photos. I mean, that's unbelievable, but believable, and nothing surprises me anymore. So, did all of these efforts have the efforts on the CIA's part? Did this during that time period have the intended effect of sort of quelling the whole UFO discussion from a public perspective?
Well, yes, it did. And one is by knocking out top scientists and engineers from studying this, the Air Force was the only one that would have the story. And so it's really hard to contradict them whenever you have, flying saucer clubs were just people that were buffs, as they were called, or enthusiasts.
Yeah.
That they're now still called, about UFOs. And so you have a situation where you take a few of the scientists off the field, and then anyone left's going to be embarrassed. And so you never saw academia pick it up. And the physicists and the engineers that would help, 9 times out of 10, if they were aeronautical engineers or scientists, they would be working on it. They'd need a clearance. You don't go to work for North American, I'm just going to work on the civilian stuff. You work on whatever you can work on. And so they were able to do that. The pictures, they didn't take all pictures. They just took the ones that showed structured craft up close. You don't need to take lights in the sky, because the pictures of lights in the sky, you never know whether they're a street light or a UFO, from the perspective of someone looking at them on the screen. But the Air Force, I thought, did the best job with a little bit of effort. In 1954, they started doing it in 53, but in 1954, the Air Force put together JNAP 146, which is a joint military, protocol, and it was for UFO reports. And what they did is, at the time, the FAA was called the CAA, and they were in charge of civilian air safety. What the Air Force did is they put a policy in place under JNAP 146 that if you saw a UFO, and the way it was defined, it only quote unquote real UFOs fit the definition. They put together this, and that any civilian or military pilot had to report them. So they had a meeting in 1954, some Air Force personnel with the different airlines in Los Angeles. They had a meeting of airlines and flat out told them, and there are 2 Scripps News Service articles on it, flat out told them, tell your pilots not to talk to the press.
Wow. Yep.
And so you have this regulation that if you violate it, you committed a felony. So the Air Force took what was supposed to be civilian air safety, moved it over to their side, and put themselves in charge of civilian air incidents if they involved a UFO. Everything else fell under CAA, which is now FAA. So you're supposed to report it. Okay, so you're a pilot for United Pan Am. You see a UFO. Are you going to report it? If you report it, the Air Force, they had three different possibilities. Either you were mistaken, you were lying, or you're delusional. If you're a commercial pilot, I don't think any one of those categories is good for you.
Not for your career, for sure.
And there was a newspaper in New Jersey in 1958 that started a nationwide survey of pilots and eventually got 400 pilots to sign it, trying to repeal this because of its impact on civilian air pilots. And so notice they did something different. For pictures taken by regular people, they just take them. Now, if you do that to everyone, you know, there isn't a club of people who took UFO pictures that didn't know about them ahead of time. They're not, they can do this one at a time, and there isn't going to be some group that's going to stop them because the reports were, they were just all over the place. You have a person in Wisconsin, one picnic. You got a person in Detroit, taking a picture with their telescope. They don't communicate with each other. There's no way for them to do that. And so you could pick those people apart. But with pilots, it was different because in the 50s, we were trying to make air flight a normal thing people did. If you start, getting pilots fired for seeing UFOs, you're also going to undermine air safety. People aren't going to be, well, if you're not, do you really want to get on a plane if you don't believe in UFOs and the pilot does and has seen one? No. So they did it in a way that they didn't want to prosecute pilots. They just wanted to make sure that they realized if they did this, it would cost them their job. And so it worked very well. It took until 2001 for NARCAP, which takes pilot reports anonymously, to get started. Very good group. And so with just a little bit of effort, now the pilots union today, the pilots union would file suit saying that the Air Force doesn't have legal authority to do this, and they might win. But back in the 50s, that kind of stuff just didn't happen. People followed the government. And so you're talking about a few different things. The Air Force Office of Special Investigation person from a particular base would go out, pick up the pictures, they'd send them to Wright-Patterson, and they'd be done. Okay, now I go back to, looking at, vandalism on the base or whatever, to other issues. And so the pictures, they just would never show up again. But they were the good ones, not, they didn't do them to the lights in the sky, but they picked out the really good ones. Like, I won't start naming others, but it's interesting. When the FBI was involved, only one person got copies of their memos on this, J. Edgar Hoover. Nobody else.
So as an attorney, what would you say were some of the civil rights that the CIA and the Air Force violated?
Well, for one thing, for the pictures taken, that's private property. That's a taking. And under the Fifth Amendment, whether it's personal property or real property, you have a right to a hearing and you have a right to reasonable compensation if the government takes something. So right there, that's one violation. For telling people that they can't talk about stuff. What right did the Air Force have to tell civilian pilots what they could talk about? They don't have authority. In the legislation, the authority for, civilian air safety doesn't even lie with the Air Force. And yet they were doing this, and it would think about this. If you're prevented from saying something, you'll never say it. That is what is called under the First Amendment a prior restraint. And so what they would do is they would use this policy to restrain pilots from talking. They're a perfect group to restrain because they're not going to file a lawsuit saying you violated their civil rights. In the 1950s, people didn't even know they had civil rights. and so you could get away with this with very little effort. And the people that took the photos may not even known they were destroyed. And so if it came back to them, did you send these on? Yes, I did, sir. That would be the end of it. So those are a couple of things, but mostly it's the First Amendment aspects of this and how they would stop people. The trouble we have is people didn't know they had a cause of action and didn't realize that something had been done wrong with them. If you lost your picture, what's a UFO picture worth? Because if you went to trial on something like that, the Air Force would bring in witnesses saying they're not real, and
Right.
you don't have any witnesses on your side. So, lawyers are not going to be able to handle these cases back then, or even see a case in them. But today,
No, please
yeah,
go ahead.
no, today it's different.
Yeah, and I guess my question is, do you think the CIA and the Air Force even cared about the fact that they were violating Americans' civil liberties?
No, I don't think they cared.
Do you think they care today?
A little more. They have to today. There wasn't a whistleblower rule till 1989. It was the first one, and it takes you. I started to show you how old I am. I started doing civil rights cases in 1980 for local governments. The Supreme Court said that cities and counties could be sued for civil rights violation of the U.S. Constitution in 1978. So when I started doing it out of law school, the partners in my firm would go, "You're crazy. You can't do this." And I got a settlement out of Hartford Insurance one time, and then a memo from the partners said, "Lough, you're not allowed to file any more of these cases. Hartford's mad at us." So in 1989, when it passed, it'd probably take 10 years for anyone to have the guts to bring a whistleblower case. And so that's the problem. Today, things are a lot more open. If someone thinks something's wrong on a larger level, on civil liberties, they'll just sue the government now, or their organizations do it. Who, except for the ACLU back in the 50s, who else? And
Yeah.
these people didn't have any connections. If you're picking on an ethnic group, or you're picking on, someone because of their orientation or culture or something, they have a group. They can talk to others in their group. How about people that took UFO pictures and never thought they were UFOs till they took one? I mean, what kind of group is that? Really good ones too,
Amazing. Yeah, I was not aware that took place. Okay, so let's jump to sort of the present time. In particular, I'd like to discuss your book, the UFO Briefing Book, a guide to congressional oversight of the UAP phenomenon. And it seems to me, and again, I'm not a ufologist, but it seems that the whole New York Times 2017 article really set things in motion. Is that correct?
I agree. There were briefings going on behind the scenes at some of these national security committees, particularly the armed services and the committees on intelligence. And so there was some of that going on, and we don't, because they're secret, we don't know how much. But the New York Times and the Politico articles that both came out the same day were like a bombshell.
They did not see that coming.
No, no. Well, think about this. My hat's off to Lou Elizondo because he got the Defense Intelligence Agency to declassify 3 UFO videos. That's never happened before, and it's never happened since. Arrow's put out a couple of drone, footage of things because the drones easy for them to get rid of.
Right.
It's much, a little ball going through the air is, it's a little easier to discount that as opposed to a 40-foot tic tac, that's flying circles around our planes. Well, they don't have to do circles. They fly straight edge lines around our planes. And so, yeah, it's totally different nowadays.
Do you sense that following the New York Times article that Congress, did they wake up and they go, wow, what has the Pentagon been doing this whole time? Were they frustrated with the kind of Pentagon inaction and the lying by the Pentagon, the lying by the CIA? Was this kind of a wake-up call, or do you think that this was always sort of in the background? It just hadn't publicly bubbled to the top.
I think it was in the background, but the trouble is it could stay in the background for the next 40 years and we wouldn't know it.
Right.
And so this broke the subject matter out into the open. And so Elizondo's declassification move was biggest thing, after Harry Reid put together the ATIP program, in 2007, is about the biggest thing going on this. And the thing we have is that you've got elected officials, and if they're on these highly classified committees, they're used to keeping their secrets until they get an answer. And I think the videos force them to start looking for an answer a lot quicker than they would have. I think that's sort of a roundabout way of saying, yeah, I guess it did. But I think that made a big difference. Because think about this. We talked a little bit about ontological shock at the beginning. You're a U.S. senator. You're briefed on that we're going to kill Osama bin Laden or capture him the next day. You already know that. You get to keep all the secrets. And all of a sudden there's something you don't know about. It's 2 different issues. Think about this. It may be a threat. And it's a threat by objects that have the capability of destroying us. There's no question they're technologically way advanced. So you have that. So are they covering up a threat? That's a big issue. And they don't know the answer to that yet. The other issue is they're hiding this from us. Under Article 1 of the Constitution, Congress is the originator of all funding. Nothing gets started without Congress. And so, wait a minute, we don't know about this stuff? So in the book, I talk about, I don't know which problem's worse. That there may be a threat, or there is a problem with the way that projects are funded that Congress in a democratic republic doesn't know what's going on. I between the two, I couldn't tell you which is worse. I mean, if someone's about ready to take over the planet, that would be worse. But they've been around for a long time, and so far, they haven't pulled over New York and sent out a laser beam yet.
Right. Well, and I think the thing is too, and I've discussed this on the air, is how can we, the people that we send to Washington, our senators, our congressmen and women, our elected representatives that are supposed to be doing the will of the people, representing the people, how can they legislate if the CIA is lying to them? How, and it even, you extrapolate this out with even American presidents that have not been read into this. How can a United States president who is representing the United States and is in charge of our military and in charge of our national defense and in foreign policy, how can it would be like not telling the president that Russia is out there with a bunch of nukes. It's like how can he arrive, or how can he even do his job if the CIA is lying to him? And it's the same thing with Congress. How can Congress do the job? How can they effectively legislate if they don't know the whole picture because the CIA is lying to them? And then, and I know I'm on a bit of a rant, but my question then is, this has to be illegal. This can't, or is it? I understand. One of the things that I understand is under the current national security infrastructure, the Undersecretary of Defense, who in this case is Kathleen Hicks, who is in charge of, she's basically the head of a special access program central office. She can decide on her own that a particular special access program is waived. So the Air Force comes to Kathy Hicks and says, "Oh, by the way, Kathy, we can't find half of our money that you guys have given us," which that's nothing new. Pentagon, Kathy Hicks can't even account for literally 50% of the money that the Pentagon has been given. So Air Force goes to Kathy Hicks and says, "Hey, we've got this special access program that's about these Tic Tacs that are not from here. It's going to cost us $1 billion a year. And oh, by the way, we don't think you should tell Congress about it." So all Kathy Hicks has to do is she as Undersecretary of Defense decides, okay, I'm going to waive that. So then all she tells Congress is the Air Force has a new special access program. It's a support program. It's going to cost $1 billion a year. What's for lunch? Where are you guys going for lunch? That's all she has to tell them. And boom, there's no congressional oversight. She has completely bypassed Congress. I'm sure it's a loophole. So legally, I guess if you're drilling down into it, I'm sure they've found a way to get around it. But standing back and certainly looking at intent, I don't see how this is legal. Is it not some sort of violation of the Constitution to bypass Congress in this way?
Article 1 requires all funding to start in Congress, in the House of Representatives. And so, to me, it's a violation. They have, I guess, under the secrecy issues, because there are a lot of nuclear weapons, there are a lot of things, stealth, that we don't want out. But they still have to be able to brief the Congress in, at least enough of the members that they've fulfilled their obligation. I don't think they've done that in these cases.
Right. My understanding is even like the Gang of Eight were not told about a bunch of things.
Notice that, to me, the significance of Chuck Schumer being involved in this issue is massive, because if he knew about this, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing. If he'd known all along, he wouldn't be doing what he's doing. No, and it's interesting. he drafted a bill that ended up with the first pushback by anyone in Congress to try to stop it. Now, who's he working with? He's working with Mike Rounds, a Republican senator from South Dakota. Their team at the end of December in 2023, they both got on the floor of the Senate. And I've never seen this in my entire life. They basically had a conversation back and forth on what they're going to do with the Schumer bill, as it's popularly known. And if Chuck Schumer knew, then why would he even do that? Because if he knew before, he obviously didn't know. And then he puts together a bill that breaks tradition in that in his bill, he gave oversight to the House Oversight Committee. Okay, that's the committee that started the Biden crime family investigations and all the crazy stuff, according to the Democrats. Why in the world would the majority leader of the Senate include them? Unless he wants it totally bipartisan. And it's interesting, when you talk about Mike Rounds and Chuck Schumer, there are two issues that they'll point people on. Number one, UAP. Number two, artificial intelligence. You think of two subjects that are more cutting edge today than those?
Right.
I mean, my goodness. And Rounds ended up being the AI person right about the time that Mitch McConnell was having some of his senior moments and at press conferences. So immediately after that, I started watching and reading everything I could about what he was doing, because there were grumbles that he'd lose his minority leader status. But he started passing out different responsibilities to different senators, and Rounds got that one. And so that tells me that they're working together. And can you think of anything else that Republicans and Democrats are working on together now?
Yeah.
Except it got a little too close to home. And so McConnell and the House Speaker and the two heads of the Republican Congress, the House's in Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, who both got vast infusions of money right from about February on from defense contractors.
During that time period they did. So you're saying that Congressman Mike Turner and whatever underlings or cohorts he had, there was an uptick in funding to these guys prior to them killing the UAP Disclosure Act?
Yes.
Son of a bitch. Wow. All right.
Well, you talk about your Swiss cheese knowledge of this subject. I spend more time reading that kind of stuff than I do watching UFO stuff or reading UFO stuff, because it has more to do with where UFO stuff is going.
Right.
And to me, with 1/3 of the public roughly thinking the UFOs are real, 1/3 thinking, nah, there's no way, and 1/3 not knowing, we're going to have some sort of group that people are going to be able to say, oh my God, this can't be true. If I love Hollywood, Morgan Freeman plays president, stands up and announces that a comet's coming and is going to destroy us all. Or, the aliens are showing up, and Jeff Daniels, the president, is going to go on, and talk about it. there's no way they would do something like that. Because can you imagine I don't care how well versed the president is, if you walked into the White House press room and started spouting off UFO stuff, you're going to get a bunch of crazy questions,
Oh
and you
yeah.
may not answer those crazy questions properly. And then you've got a worldwide crisis because the president doesn't know what he's talking about. And, with 66% of the public, you know. And so it takes a while to build, and it needs to come bipartisan. And so far, I'm just thrilled that, except for the one bump over the Schumer bill, everything stayed pretty much bipartisan. And, you have some, it's not like it's only middle of the road people involved. You got Chuck Schumer on one side. I mean, you've got to, you can't become, the Senate majority leader by being, I'm not being partisan.
Right.
You've got that, and just look at the makeup of the UAP caucus. It's mostly the, people that aren't in the majority, aren't in the leadership of the Republican Party.
Right. Yeah.
And so Tim Burchett, people, I mean, he's just a fairly new congressman. And yet he's at the top of the food chain on this because, he's been able to step out and do it. But the people, most of the Congress don't know what's going on. They'll follow the lead of the committees because they've always trusted them. Because if you're a Republican and Marco Rubio and Mike Rounds and several people that you trust say there's something to this, you're going to believe it.
Of course.
You're going to vote on that, because these bills, when they came through 3 straight years of legislation, can you think of another subject where they've done that?
No,
I mean,
not.
what happens is this is what I did for a living. Bills are passed in 1 year. They don't come back unless someone made a mistake the next year, and where they're curing some mistake that got, like, they put in the, someone put the words backwards or something. 3 years in a row on a subject that Dennis Kucinich got run out of the presidential race in 1992 by bringing up.
Yeah, that is amazing. The bipartisan aspect. I mean, I'm a Democrat. I tell everyone that, but I am 100% supportive of our Republican lawmakers that are, that have the guts to speak up about this.
Yes.
As you mentioned, Tim Burchett, I would have him on this show in a minute. I think it is critical for this thing to move forward, that all of us treat this in a bipartisan way, that everyone in DC treat this as a bipartisan way. I mean, you've had Tim Burchett go out of his way to compliment AOC, and they certainly don't agree on probably almost everything. I certainly don't agree with Tim Burchett on most things. But you know what? If he's gonna go out there and put his ass on the line on the UAP issue, I don't care if I'm a Democrat or not. I'm going to support that guy. And I think that it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you are on, we owe it to these folks, to the Tim Burchetts, to the Anna-Paulina Luna, to Senator Gillibrand. We owe it, regardless of what party we typically vote for, to support these politicians, because they are really going out on a political ledge, hanging their hat on this. And I mean, you look at Tim Burchett, I can't even imagine the amount of blowback he must get in his party, especially from people like Mike Turner. So when we have people like Burchett and others that frankly have the balls to go after this, I have such high respect for that. Because if you didn't have the Burchetts out there and the Gillibrands and the Rubios and the Schumers, we wouldn't be having this conversation, and we probably wouldn't be having this conversation for another 20 years. It's because they see the corruption that has led to all of this, and they are well aware that the CIA is willfully lying to them and lying to Congress as the legislative body writ large. It's it's just nuts. But I'm glad they've kept it bipartisan. I've often worried that some of the really hyper-partisan folks, such as Gaetz or some others, would take it into the partisan lane, but they haven't done that. And I really, my hat is off to them for keeping it right down the middle, which is where it needs to stay.
If what is out there, what I think it is, telling the public that we've been visited by multiple races, multiple, platforms, and this is all real. If we don't have some preparation ahead of time, and if we don't have them all, I always talk about if you're going to jump off a cliff, you want someone to go with you.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so think about this. If looking at it from the politician's perspective is, I'm not doing this on my own. You need people with you. And this one's so big that if you just have Republicans or just have Democrats, you're still going to get killed.
Yes.
You need to have this, and you need to have it unveiled in a way that will not cause people to doubt what they're saying. Like, one thing that really gets my goat is that you've got people threatening NASA, Aero, of course they're UFOs. If you don't tell it, we're going to come and beat you up or whatever the threats are. But both organizations have talked about threats. You have to think about this from their perspective, people who don't know. We have to make sure they are given a good foundation of why to believe this and why to change their perspective on not just, a political issue, but our standing in the universe and where we sit. It was the Catholic Church was upset with Galileo. You got to, at each step, you end up with people who have to step out. We have a unique opportunity here to have a Congress take the lead on this. And I don't think the military and the CIA and the intelligence community are fighting it. I don't see either under the Trump administration or the White House fighting it, or the Biden administration today. During that sort of interlude at the beginning, you had a lot of, first Elizondo gets the 3 videos released. The Pentagon doesn't recognize that they're declassified from December 16th, when they first got in the New York Times and Politico, to April of 2020, they refused to admit it. And they finally posted them then. And so people are scrambling at the top. Politically, I don't think the Biden administration knows the depth of all this, because there have been a couple political moves by the Pentagon that sort of show me where they've come from. If you remember, in 2021, there was the bill going through Congress just starting, and then the report came out from the UAP task force, on June 25th, 2021, in response to Marco Rubio's request. Well, after that report came out, then Gillibrand put together her massively effective amendment. And so during that time period when that was out and being debated in front of the Senate, Kathleen Hicks held a press conference and announced a new program, AIMSOG. I mean, could we figure out a more difficult acronym to use?
Yeah.
I mean, perfect for this, for them to do this. And so what did she do? She had a press conference 2 days before Thanksgiving, while the Senate was debating the issue itself, came up with their own program that had none of the protections of the Gillibrand. And then after, in the press release, which is you can't find anymore from the Pentagon office, in that press release, it says details will be coming out later about, the specifics of this program. And so, in other words, they slapped something together because of the Gillibrand bill that scared the crap out of them, threw it up, put it a couple of days before Thanksgiving so the public really wouldn't see it, and try to get a program to bait and switch so the Senate would drop the bill.
Yes.
And it was Keystone Cops. It didn't work. Now, fast forward to this year, when AARO releases part 1 of the report that doesn't say anything except there's no evidence of UFOs. Now, before they did that, they had a press briefing. And that press briefing only invited traditional defense reporters. The debrief wasn't invited. Anyone that would say something different. In other words, under the Constitution, under the First Amendment, they picked the people based on their viewpoint to hear it. So then they have this report that was ready in February. And so when do they release it? They release it on March 8th. Now, calendar-wise, being an election attorney, I'd know all this, but March 5th was Super Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
What happened Super Tuesday? Biden and Trump became the presumptive nominees because of a massive political miscalculation by the new speaker. He invited Biden to speak on Thursday the 7th for a State of the Union. So what he did is he handed him the biggest audience he would ever get to give a partisan speech, which is what State of the Union addresses usually are, and be able to talk to the public about it and have the stage to himself without Trump giving the response. And so Biden, everyone said, hit a home run. So the next morning, when the press is just all they can talk about, the State of the Union and what happened, AARO releases the report. So do people see it? No. They're busy because the news blocks, on your typical Fox or MSNBC news show, you have 4 blocks. None of them are going to have UFOs in them.
Right.
There's no way they're going to do that. They're going to cover Biden. So what did the Defense Department do? Because they didn't even, the release of this report, they didn't even get the intelligence community. The Office of the head of the intelligence, April, I can't think of her last name off the top of my head.
Avril Haines, ODNI director.
Avril Haines, yeah.
Yeah.
She did not sign off on it.
Right.
That's pretty significant. Now, it comes out the day whenever Biden's basking in his wonderful coverage, and there was no way that any of those 4 blocks would end up with, a UFO story. So
Right.
in other words, that was a Friday when stories go to die. So everyone that read about it or learned about it on that day during that news cycle only heard it from defense reporters that don't think UFOs are real. So the Pentagon, someone in the Pentagon stepped on President Biden's biggest moment to release this. So it's obvious the White House didn't know about it because the White House probably didn't put out anything on that day besides this. And so what you've got is someone in the Pentagon is trying to hide it and using the president's State of the Union as a shield. And so they were able to get away with that. And it was quite a public relations boost for the Pentagon because they buried it. And so if people ask about it now, anything on UFOs? Oh, yeah, they had something saying that they're not real. And there was no pushback. It took weeks for people to put something together. Chris Mellon had a very good analysis of it, but it took him 3 weeks to do it. So they captured the news cycle. So they've gone from Keystone Cops trying to stop the Gillibrand amendment to all of a sudden it looks like a bunch of K Street consultants helped them figure out how to do this.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, the Pentagon Public Affairs Office and Susan Goff, yeah, we know that's exactly what happened is they brought people in, gave them early access, people that they knew would put out the headline, no aliens or whatever. So, you've got Julian Barnes and the rest of the that whole clown show that are nothing but Pentagon shills putting out all of this propaganda. And that's the other thing too. It is obvious that the CIA, the Pentagon are running an active disinformation campaign on the American populace. That is illegal. You cannot do that, and they are doing it. It's almost as if they're like, you know what, if you want to come at me, go for it. It's like they don't care. And the other thing too, you talk about Kathy Hicks. I can tell you how this whole program has been managed. It's not the elected people. It's not even the Secretary of Defense, the director of the CIA, the elected people. All of the people that have managed this entire program, that have kept it under wraps, they are all the deputy levels, the career lifers, the ones that are high-level senior executive service folks. They are the ones that view Congress as temporary employees. They are the ones that view the president as a temporary employee. And they are the ones that have decided that they don't need to know about all of this. And what a slap in the face to this Constitution, to our Constitution, and what our founding fathers did by this clearly undemocratic behaving as if they are operating a military junta. It's insane, and I think that is why. I mean, you spoke earlier about what is the worst threat? The fact that there may be something out there that is probably not good news. That is my personal opinion. Or the fact that you've got the CIA and the Pentagon who has decided that our democracy really shouldn't be a democracy and they should really be running the show. That is frightening.
Worse. Yeah, which is worse. And see, that's and it's not just that democracy, is at stake, but I taught decision making in urban communities. It was a class about how decisions are made during crises and how things are done. And one of the things about the social science and the in decision-making issues um, that is pretty well established now is that if you have groups making decisions that don't have all the information, the chances that they're right is going to go like that. Oops, I should go the other way.
Right.
Yeah. Oh, well, I'll figure it out later. But that's why I can never tell righty, tighty, lefty, loosey. I have to have that.
Right. Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
they have they they have to know what they're voting on, and they don't. And so you're not going to make a good decision if you don't know if there are factors that you do not have. It's like I always joke that the reason we're in we'll have some massive public hearing where everyone's complaining. Well, how come this project's been in the works for years? How come the public doesn't know about it? Well, perhaps you shouldn't have a bunch of middle-aged traffic engineers doing it. Maybe you should have had someone else get involved besides someone that's
Right.
used to dealing with the public.
So so we have about 15 minutes left. I want to talk briefly about your book, the UFO Briefing Book, a guide to congressional oversight of the UAP phenomenon. Tell us a bit about that book and the recommendations that you made. And then also, too, I understand that members of Congress and their staffers have used this as a reference.
Yes, I've been told that. I have not been to Washington. Um, this all started when Marco Rubio uh, came out in a report in 2020 asking that when the Intelligence Authorization Act passes, that within 6 months we want to report on UAP. I was working on Threat to the Body Politic. I immediately dropped it and started writing this book. And the book gives Congress a little background. There's a history portion of it about UFOs, but it's not a history portion about, this craft or that craft or this sighting or that sighting. It's mostly a history that intersected with public policy. And by what I did is I wanted to put together and give them a copy of this book, because I published the book because it's cheaper to publish a book than to just go down to Kinko's and print up a book. And so that's why it became a public book. But my purpose was to send to Congress, and I sent 300 copies, and mostly to not just to Congress, but I hit every one of the national defense committees. So everyone got a copy of it. And I told them, number one, the Air Force, the Pentagon, the intelligence community, they're all going to slow walk whatever they give to you, and they're going to fight tooth and nail to do it. So expect that. And so unfortunately, I've been right on that one.
That's for sure. Yeah, the amount the Pentagon bullshit machine that is in full effect over there certainly seems to be having some effect. That's for sure. Anyway, yeah, please.
They're very good at what they do.
Yes,
they're very good at what they do.
Bullshit.
But I wanted to also give them some items that could help loosen up, this problem. And so I suggested that they strengthen the rules on whistleblowers. I suggested that they strengthen the rules on FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, to allow more records to automatically come out, which ended up in the Schumer bill, and tried to give them as many examples as possible. Like 1988, the General Accounting Office issued a report that said that the Pentagon has no way to track materials that they've given to defense contractors. No way. And so by the time the response came back, it's like a grand jury. They give them time to respond. A civil grand jury will ask a governmental entity, you did something wrong, report back to us what you're going to do. By the time they reported back in 1989, Pentagon said, fixed, we did it. Well, it's an interesting time that they had with records and materials that were given to defense contractors they lost track of. Well, it fits right with this period here. And so I wanted to give them, so I pointed that out. I wanted to give them some tips as to where to look. And so I didn't say you need to change section 55 of this section to do this or that. I gave them general guidance because the way things work is your senator doesn't sit down and draft legislation. They have staffers that do that, and they know what they're doing. Usually the staffers have been there a long time, especially on these committees. And so I wanted to give them some general concepts, like if they're not getting enough witnesses, having like during the after the Vietnam War, Carter had an amnesty period where people who committed crimes, tore up their draft card or whatever, if they came and reported now and came back, they could not face any prosecution. So I suggested a sort of a period like that. And it's sort of, if you look at the legislation, the language on reports from programs within the Pentagon that are secret. And they've talked about giving them 6 months to, come clean, that kind of stuff. So I gave some general concepts, but I didn't want to there's nothing, having been on the staff side of these things, there's nothing worse than being told, you don't know what the hell you're doing. I know all the answers. You just write down what I'm doing.
Right.
And so I tried to be a little generic about it. I knew I was successful when a friend of mine who is a retired city manager that had worked for the federal government, he read my book and said he didn't know anything about UFOs. He read my book and said, Jim, this is a 128-page staff report telling them while they may not understand it, this is what they need to do, and explaining it to them. And so I felt vindicated because my goal was to help them figure it out. And so through secondary sources, I've heard that it has been used, because I didn't really publish the book. I did 2 podcasts, both about the book when it came out, both of which were set up by friends of mine, not me, because my goal was I needed to spend my time on writing letters. And I did follow-up letters to Congress. I worked with Robert Salas for about a year, and we put together a series of papers that went to Congress. And so now the Soul Foundation's picking up this kind of thing, because I looked around and didn't see anyone like that. Well, we're starting to build an infrastructure that's going to make it hard for them to go back, because there are now institutions trying to push forward.
Sorry, please.
No, I'm done.
Oh, okay. So we're going to wrap it up here. What do you think that there is a good chance that they will take another sort of stab at the Schumer amendment, or do you think that the fact that we are in an election cycle, it'll be something that both parties don't want to touch?
What did Yoda say? Future, hard to tell.
that is for sure.
I don't know the answer. I wish I knew the answer,
Same.
but the thing is, if we have a 1 year hiatus, I was in government for 40 years. You know, a 1 year hiatus is nothing. UFO people are really hair on fire about it, but it's going to happen. It's got to go naturally, or else it's not going to work. And it'll be tough during 2024. My guess is 2025 is going to be a big year for this.
I certainly hope so. Well, thanks for joining us. So again, you've got two books here: the UFO Briefing Book, a guide to congressional oversight of the UAP phenomenon and threat to the body politic, Foo Fighters to UAP, from James Lough. We can find all of this on Amazon, I take it?
Yes, you can.
Awesome, great. Well,
had a lot of problems printing them, but my editor said, "Gee, I've never had problems like this before." And I go, "Well, you've probably never done a UFO book."
There you go. Well, Jim, thanks for joining us, and thanks for doing this with such last minute notice. I really appreciate it.
I enjoy talking about it, so I appreciate it.
Awesome. Okay, Jim, thank you so much.
Matt.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, there you go. I thought that was a really great conversation. So if you enjoyed our show, we would certainly appreciate it if you would hit that subscribe button and leave a comment. I generally read pretty much every comment. I don't have time usually to respond, but when I can find a moment, I do. But I do 99.9% of the comments I do read, and very much appreciate it. And of course, please tell your friends about us on social media. The more people that watch, the more we can spread our message on this, what we think is a very vital topic. Interestingly enough, so on YouTube, you can put hashtags on there in like the YouTube description or the title, and YouTube will only take the first three hashtags. So I've had as the hashtag, the set of hashtags on our show on YouTube, I've had pound UFO, pound UAP, and then pound Good Trouble Show, or The Good Trouble Show. I think that's what it was. Anyway, one of our listeners left a comment on YouTube and said, you know what, when I click on pound UFO on your, because it shows up in the title or in the description, when I click on it, it brings up a window that says there's no information here or something like that. So sure enough, I looked at our past videos, and when you look at it and you see in bold the hashtags, you click on it, and sure enough, for both UFO and UAP, YouTube is not using those hashtags. It takes you to a window that says no information here or something like that. So I was worried that my account had been flagged by YouTube. So I reached out to their technical support, and I have to say they were very, very responsive. I had to create a video displaying the issue and whatnot, and how long it had been going on. Well, they finally responded and very graciously, and said that for pound UFO and pound UAP, they do not use those hashtags, do not work by design. By design. So, take that however you want. They said that the best thing that I could do is go to they have a suggestions link or something like that. But the fact that YouTube is, you can look up any other kind of hashtag like pound politics or pound whatever, but they do not, they're filtering out pound UFO and pound UAP. And I wonder why. You have to ask yourself. Again, this coming Sunday, literally a week from today at 12 noon Pacific, we have Dr. Avi Loeb. We'll post a link up for that probably tomorrow morning. I'm going to go and have some Cinco de Mayo fun. But anyway, thanks for tuning in. We really appreciate everyone's time on a Sunday listening to our show. We're running a little bit long today, so. Thanks for everyone joining us. Don't drink and drive. Be safe, enjoying your Cinco de Mayo, and we will see you next week.